Friends and viewers, good day. Stephen King last night I also discussed with you about one of his novel, The Stand. And today again I came with his another novel. The name of this novel is Misery. This is published in the year 1987 and written in 19 This is the Stephen King's psychological horror novel. Misery tells the story of Paul Sheldon, a best-selling American author of a series of romance novels set in the 19th century featuring the protagonist Misery Chastain. Paul finds himself in a situation where he was not just writing for his super, but for his life when his self-proclaimed number one fan, a middle-aged former nurse named Anya Wilkes, rescued him from a car accident during a snowstorm in Colorado. Annie's fandom, though, turns out to be a dangerous obsession. Paul fights for his life as Anya's mania turns more perilous, and Paul races to finish the novel Anya has forced to write Misery's return. Misery begins just after Paul's car accident when Anya pulls him out of his car and drives him to her house, a remote farm outside the fictional Sidewinder, Colorado. Paul suffers severe leg injuries, which Anya sets crudely and treats him with a painkiller with a heavy codeine based called Novril. Paul had just left the Boulderado Hotel after finishing First Cars, his novel that did not feature Misery. Misery died 5 pages from the end of Misery's Child, the last novel in the Misery series. Drunk on celebratory champagne and caught off guard by a storm, Paul crashes his Camaro while reaching from his cigarette. Paul quickly realized that Anya is dangerously crazy and is keeping him captive in her home. After reading the Fast Cars manuscript while Paul recovers, Anna becomes upset with its profanity. Her anger causes her to throw a soup bowl against a wall, shattering it. After cleaning it up later, Anya forces Paul to use soapy water to swallow his Novril. When Anya finished reading Misery's Child and discovered Misery has died, she became so upset that she leaves Paul alone for days. When Anya returns, she forces Paul to burn his Fast Cars manuscript, then buys him a Royal typewriter and tells him to write his best novel, Misery's Return. Paul struggles to come up with a convincing way to bring Misery back to life. Through Anya's coercion and a single hesitant suggestion, though, Paul managed to come up with something Anya described as a good and exciting. With a few exceptions, Paul and Anya fell into a kind of agreeable rhythm. For the next 3 weeks, Paul writes an amazingly straight life. Endangered is captor Annie, who for her part remained cool and collected. Then the weather changes and Annie sinks into a depression, leaving Paul alone again. During this time, Paul ventures out of his room and discovers a scrapbook filled with newspaper clipping from Anya's life. Paul discovered that Anya's began murdering people at the age of 11 during her career as a nurse. Anya murdered dozens of elderly people and infants. She was charged and tried for only one infant's death, and though the jury believed Anya was guilty, they had very reasonable doubt as to her guilt. After this, Anya no longer worked as a nurse. When Anya returns from her laughing place where she goes to be alone, Anya tells Paul that his Camaro has been swept away in the spring snow melt. Anya then tells Paul that she knows he's left his room multiple times. As punishment, Anya humbles Paul by cutting off his left foot with an axe. Paul continues writing as he recovers from his amputation. He and Anya reach an uneasy peace until a young police officer named Kushner arrives at Anya's house. Paul screams from inside his room, then throws his ashtray out of the window, getting the officer's attention. Officer Kushner recognizes Paul as the missing writer he is looking for, but Anya strikes and kills Kushner with her lawn mower. After this murder, Paul knows that all almost over for he and Anya. Paul decides he's going to kill Anya before he can kill him. State Trooper Wilkes and McWright arrive shortly after Kushner's disappearance. They question Anya but don't arrest her. This time, Paul doesn't try to get their attention. He resolved to finish Misery's Return in a relative peace. That also becomes he wants to kill Anya himself. After finishing Misery's Return, Paul burns the manuscript in front of a horrified Anya and then brings his royal typewriter down on her back, breaking it. After severely injuring Anya, Paul crawls out of his room, looks to the door behind him, hides in the bathroom. That evening, troopers Wilkes and McKnight return and rescue Paul. Paul is terrified to learn that the troopers didn't find Anya in the house, though he screams until he faints. At the novel's end, Paul is back in New York, meeting with his editor about Misery's Return. Though Paul, publisher, has ordered an unprecedented first writing of 1,000,000 copies, Paul can't relax. He replaced novel with alcohol and still has major pain in his legs. Paul can't write and his horrible vision of Anya come to attack him, though he learns from the trooper that they found Anya dead from her injuries and her burn. Finally, seeing a boy on the street with a skunk brick, Paul writes block. He begins to write again, weeps over his typewriter. Misery explores Stephen King's own experience with writer's block, drug addiction, feeling stifled with his reputation as a writer of horror novels. Through the extended metaphors of Paul's stimulation, imprisonment and dependence on his biggest fan, Anya, King shows the complicated relationship between writer and a reader, as well as writer's own relationship to this process. This is the story of The Misery by Stephen King. So the theme involved in this novel is as because the Anya was obsessed with, and she was a very dangerous and a psychic patient and a fan of Paul Sheldon. The theme is writing process. The novel star Paul Sheldon, best-selling author of Misery, complete his first non-misery novel, Fast Car. With it, Paul hopes to earn respect series. The people who read the Misery novel, women like Anya Wilkes, Paul's self-proclaimed #1 fan, have no concern for writing technique. Rather, they just want a good story. Anya doesn't have a better understanding of writing than Paul thinks she does. For example, she convinces her writing as God to the peoples. In Paul's mind, Anya's represent the monolithic obstacle he must overcome in order to write Misery Return. As Paul captive, Anya's provides Paul with physical equipment and environment necessary to write. So, after Paul has returned to New York from his captivity, Misery Return is set to be published and becomes an international bestseller due to the interest in the circumstances it was written. Paul resets the suggestion to write a non-fiction account his own experience. He is able to walk with a prosthesis but suffer nightmarish shattered joy and able to write again. So this is the story of The Misery, written by Stephen King.